She was the legitimate heir to the Holy Roman Empire, born to wear the crown of Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. Yet she was branded as tainted, rumored to be rotten from the inside, and ruthlessly erased from history by her own uncle. Her name was Maria Josepha. How did a princess born to rule the world have her destiny stolen by a single shameful secret flowing through her father's veins? That downfall was inevitable. By 1699, the House of Habsburg was trapped in a fatal stranglehold between two realities that could no longer coexist: the vast imperial ambition that demanded they rule the world, and the twisted inbred genetics that ensured they would not survive it. The House of Habsburg had ruled for centuries, their dominion stretching across Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and vast territories in Italy. Their motto was famous across the world: Bella gerant alli, tu felix Austria nubi. Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. For generations, they had built their power not just with cannons and muskets, but with wedding rings, consolidating land through strategic intermarriage. But by the turn of the 18th century, nature was beginning to collect the debt for centuries of genetic insularity. The Spanish branch of the family was dying out, represented by the tragic figure of King Charles II of Spain, a man so physically and mentally disabled by inbreeding that his death was imminent, threatening to plunge Europe into a massive war over his vacant throne. In Vienna, the Austrian branch of the family was terrified of suffering the same fate. The reigning emperor, Leopold I, Maria Josepha's grandfather, was an old man, deeply religious, dressed perpetually in black, ruling over a court that was stiff, ceremonial, and obsessed with death. The air in the Hofburg was heavy with incense and anxiety. The dynasty faced a terrifying crisis, a scarcity of male heirs. In a world governed by Salic law, which strictly forbade women from inheriting the crown, the lack of a son meant the end of the world. It meant the fragmentation of the empire, the invasion of predatory neighbors like France and Prussia, and the collapse of God's chosen order. The entire weight of this crumbling edifice rested on the shoulders of one young man, Archduke Joseph. As the eldest son of Leopold I, Joseph was the king of the Romans, the heir apparent, the shining star of the dynasty. Born in 1678, Joseph was everything the old dour Emperor Leopold was not. He was handsome, with a fiery, dynamic energy. He was a brilliant musician, a forward-thinking reformer, and a man who chafed against the rigid, suffocating etiquette of the Spanish-style court. The people of Vienna loved him. They saw in him a new dawn, a modern ruler who would sweep away the cobwebs of the past and lead Austria into a glorious future. But Joseph had a fatal flaw, a darkness that would ultimately doom his daughter, Maria Josepha, to a life of exclusion. Joseph was a man of immense appetites. In the pious, hypocritical atmosphere of Vienna, where public morality was strictly policed by the Jesuits, Joseph lived a double life. He was wildly, recklessly promiscuous. His affairs were legendary, involving ladies of the court, maids, and commoners alike. He lived fast, driven by a sense of invincibility that often accompanies young princes who have never been told no. But in the early 18th century, sexual promiscuity carried a risk far deadlier than scandal. It carried the risk of the French disease, syphilis. Around 1704, the catastrophe that the court physicians had feared finally struck. Historical records and private correspondences confirm that the young heir to the throne contracted syphilis. Today we treat this with a simple course of antibiotics. In the early 1700s, it was a death sentence. It was a gruesome, slow-moving horror that rotted the body from the inside out, causing madness, disfigurement, and agonizing pain. Treatments of the time were often worse than the disease itself, involving toxic mercury vapors that made the patient's teeth fall out and their skin turn gray. But beyond the physical pain, syphilis carried a profound moral stigma. It was seen as a judgment from God, a mark of sin, a taint on the blood that could not be washed away. Tragically, Joseph did not suffer alone. He passed the disease to his young wife, Wilhelmina Amalie of Brunswick-Lüneburg. Wilhelmina was a gentle, deeply religious woman who adored her charismatic husband despite his flaws. The transmission of this disease was a dynastic disaster of epic proportions. Wilhelmina Amalia had already given birth to a daughter, Maria Josepha, in 1699, and another daughter, Maria Amalia, in 1701. But the infection ravaged her reproductive system. After 1701, the physicians confirmed the worst. The Empress was infertile. There would be no more children. Most devastatingly, there would be no sons. The tainted blood, a mix of rumor, biological reality, and moral judgment became the defining shadow over the family. The Golden Prince, the hope of the empire, had sterilized the royal line through his own indiscretions. Let us rewind slightly to the moment of our protagonist's arrival. On December 8, 1699, before the disease had fully ravaged the family's future, Wilhelmina Amalia went into labor in the drafty, velvet-draped chambers of the Hofburg. The court held its breath. A son would secure the dynasty for another generation. A daughter would be a disappointment, merely a pawn for a future marriage alliance. When the infant was presented, a healthy, screaming girl, there was a collective sigh of resignation, but also celebration. She was the first grandchild of Emperor Leopold I. They named her Maria Josepha. In her earliest years, Maria Josepha was the center of her parents' world. She was a bright, serious child, very different from her volatile father. She inherited her mother's piety and her grandfather Leopold's sense of duty. She was raised in the strictest Catholic tradition, surrounded by Jesuits who taught her that her life belonged to God and the House of Austria. She learned Latin, French, Italian, and the complex dance-like etiquette of the imperial court. She learned that she was a Habsburg, and that meant she was superior to every other human being on earth, chosen by divine right to lead. But as she grew from a toddler into a young girl, the atmosphere in the palace shifted from celebration to panic. Her mother's subsequent inability to conceive a son turned Maria Josepha into a figure of immense political anxiety. She was the heir presumptive, but her gender was a legal barrier that the empire did not know how to navigate. The whispers in the corridors grew louder. Courtiers looked at the young girl and wondered if the poison in her father's blood ran in hers as well. Was she healthy? Was she clean? These cruel, unfounded speculations would haunt her for the rest of her life, used by her enemies to argue that she was unfit to rule. By 1703, the situation was critical. Emperor Leopold was dying. His eldest son Joseph had no male heir. His younger son Charles was unmarried and currently fighting in Spain, trying to claim the Spanish throne. The Habsburg line was hanging by a thread. Realizing that the extinction of the male line was a very real possibility, the family decided to take a drastic, secret step to preserve the unity of their lands. On September 12, 1703, in a private ceremony shrouded in secrecy, Archduke Joseph and his brother Archduke Charles signed a document that would define Maria Josepha's life. It was called the Pactum Mutuae Successionis, the Mutual Pact of Succession. This legal contract was a revolutionary break from tradition. It established that if the male line died out, the daughters of the Habsburgs would be eligible to inherit the throne. But there was a crucial hierarchy established in this pact, a hierarchy that favored Maria Josepha above all others. The pact explicitly stated that the daughters of the elder brother would take precedence over the daughters of the younger brother. This meant that if Joseph died without a son, his eldest daughter, Maria Josepha, would become the Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia, and Archduchess of Austria. She would be the sovereign. At 4 years old, Maria Josepha was legally designated as the future of the dynasty. The pact was signed, sealed, and witnessed. It was a binding family law, a sacred promise between brothers. When Emperor Leopold I finally died in 1705, and Maria Josepha's father ascended the throne as Emperor Joseph I, her status increased even further. She was now the Dauphine of the empire in all but name. Her father, despite his illness, loved her and fully intended for her to succeed him if he failed to produce a son. For the next 6 years, Maria Josepha lived as the heir. She was educated not just to be a wife, but to understand the complexities of the court. She watched her father reform the tax system, reorganize the bureaucracy, and wage war against France. She was absorbing the lessons of queenship, but fate, as it often does in the history of the Habsburgs, was sharpening its knife. The promise of the 1703 pact relied on the honor of the men who signed it, and as Maria Josepha would soon discover, honor is often the first casualty when supreme power is at stake. Her father's health was deteriorating, not just as from the syphilis that racked his joints and clouded his mind, but from the immense stress of the War of the Spanish Succession. The clock was ticking, and in the shadows her Uncle Charles, the man who would become her nemesis, was watching, waiting, and calculating. He had no intention of letting his brother's daughter sit on a throne he believed belonged to him and his future children alone. The stage was set for the great betrayal. The little girl, praying in the Hofburg chapel, had no idea that the document securing her future was about to be torn apart, and that the tainted blood of her father would be the weapon used to destroy her birthright. The turning point of Maria Josepha's life arrived with the brutality of a thunderclap. It was April 1711. The spring had come to Vienna, bringing with it the usual thawing of the Danube and the stirring of life in the city's gardens. But inside the Hofburg Palace, a darkness was spreading that no sunlight could pierce. Emperor Joseph I, the vigorous 32-year-old ruler who had embodied the hope of a modern Austria, had collapsed. The court physicians initially whispered about the old sickness, the syphilis that had plagued him for years, assuming his libertine past was finally exacting its ultimate price. But as the emperor's fever spiked and angry red pustules began to cover his body, the diagnosis changed to something far more immediate and contagious: smallpox. Smallpox was the great leveler of the 18th century. It cared nothing for titles, pacts, or divine rights. It ravaged the emperor with terrifying speed. For Maria Josepha, then only 11 years old, the terror must have been absolute. She was kept away from her father's chambers to protect her from infection, leaving her to wait in the agonizing silence of her own rooms, listening to the hurried footsteps of priests and doctors echoing in the corridors. On April 17, 1711, the bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral began to toll the slow, heavy rhythm of mourning. Josepha was dead. The death of Josepha was a geopolitical earthquake. In an instant, the center of gravity in Europe shifted. The dynamic reformer was gone, and with him died the protection that had shielded Maria Josepha. She was no longer the cherished daughter of the reigning monarch. She was now the orphan of a dead king, left alone in a court that was rapidly reorganizing itself around a new power. According to the mutual pact of succession signed in 1703, Maria Josepha was now technically the heir to the Habsburg lands after her uncle. But the man who was about to ascend the throne had no intention of honoring the promises made by a dead brother. The crown passed to Joseph's younger brother, Archduke Charles. At the time of Joseph's death, Charles was not even in Austria. He was in Barcelona fighting a losing battle for the Spanish throne during the War of the Spanish Succession. When the news reached him, he abandoned his Spanish ambitions and began the long journey back to Vienna to claim the Holy Roman Empire. When Charles VI finally arrived in Vienna, the atmosphere of the court changed overnight. If Joseph had been the German emperor, open, reforming, and relatively accessible, Charles VI was thoroughly Spanish. Charles had spent his formative years surrounded by Spanish advisors, obsessed with the rigid, almost mystical etiquette of the court of Madrid. He was a man of profound haughtiness, obsessed with ceremony, protocol, and absolute control. He viewed himself not just as a ruler, but as a divine figure who could reshape reality through his will. To Charles, the mutual pact of succession of 1703 was an inconvenience. It was a document signed in a moment of weakness, a contingency plan for a worst-case scenario. Now that he was emperor, he saw no reason why he should be bound by it. He looked at his 11-year-old niece, Maria Josepha, and did not see a future empress. He saw a rival. He saw a relic of his brother's reign, a reign he intended to surpass. Furthermore, Charles VI was deeply paranoid about the rumors surrounding his brother's health. The tainted blood narrative was a weapon lying on the table waiting to be picked up. Charles, who was ostensibly healthy, viewed Joseph's line as compromised. In his mind, the stability of the empire required a fresh start, a new line free from the scandal of syphilis. He decided that his own children who had not even been born yet, must take precedence over the living, breathing niece who stood before him. 2 years after his brother's death, Charles VI made his move. It was a cool morning in April 1713 when the emperor summoned his privy council and the Knights of the Golden Fleece to the Hofburg. In a ceremony designed to emphasize his absolute authority, he unveiled a document that would become the defining obsession of his life, the pragmatic sanction. To the untrained eye, the sanction appeared to be a sound legal document ensuring the indivisibility of the Habsburg lands. It stated that the territories of Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary could never be split apart. This was a wise and necessary move, but buried within the legal language was a clause of devastating betrayal. The sanction established a new order of succession. It declared that if the emperor died without male heirs, the throne would pass to his daughters. And then, in a direct reversal of the 1703 pact, it explicitly stated that his daughters would outrank the daughters of his predecessor, Joseph I. With this decree, Charles VI legally demoted Maria Josepha. He stripped her of her birthright. In 1711, she had been the heir presumptive. In 1713, she was merely the Archduchess cousin, a backup plan to a backup plan. Imagine the humiliation for a teenage girl who had been raised to rule. Maria Josepha stood in the court and watched as the nobility of Austria swore allegiance to this new law. She watched as the men who had bowed to her father now bowed to a document that erased her future. There is no record of her screaming or weeping in public. Habsburg training forbade such displays of emotion. She stood with her back straight, her face a mask of calm, while her uncle stole her crown. But the psychological wound must have been immense. She was being told publicly and legally that she was less valuable than a hypothetical child. She was being punished for existing. For the next 6 years, from 1713 to 1719, Maria Josepha lived in a strange, suspended state of existence. She was a prisoner of luxury, trapped in the golden cage of the Vienna court. She was too high-ranking to be ignored, but too dangerous to be given any real influence. Charles VI treated her with a cold, formal courtesy. He ensured she was well-dressed and well-fed, but he kept her completely isolated from political power. He was terrified that a faction of nobles might rally around her and demand the restoration of the old succession rights. To neutralize this threat, Charles VI encouraged the whispers about her father's syphilis to continue circulating. It was a subtle, insidious campaign of character assassination. The court gossips murmured that Maria Josepha's blood was corrupt, that she would likely be barren like her mother, or that she would produce monsters. It was a way of devaluing her on the European marriage market. After all, who would want to marry a princess with a disputed claim to a throne and a potential genetic curse? Yet, in this period of isolation, Maria Josepha's character was forged. Denied the power of the throne, she turned to the power of the Spirit. She became intensely religious, mirroring the devout Catholicism of her mother, Empress Wilhelmina Amalia. But unlike the gloomy, fearful religion of her grandfather, Maria Josepha's faith was resilient. She found solace in the Jesuits, who remained her closest advisors. She focused on her education, becoming fluent in politics and history, preparing herself for a role she might never be allowed to play. She and her younger sister, Maria Amalia, formed a tight, protective bond, two sisters against the world, the last remnants of Joseph I's tragic line. By 1719, Maria Josepha was 19 years old. In the eyes of the 18th century court, she was nearing spinsterhood. Charles VI knew he had to get rid of her. As long as she remained in Vienna unmarried, she was a living symbol of his betrayal. He needed to marry her off to a foreign prince, preferably one far enough away that she couldn't cause trouble, but powerful enough to be a useful ally. Enter Augustus II of Poland, also known as Augustus the Strong, the Elector of Saxony. Augustus was a massive, boisterous man, famous for bending horseshoes with his bare hands and fathering hundreds of illegitimate children. He was also incredibly ambitious. He wanted to secure the Polish crown for his son, Frederick Augustus, and he knew that a marriage into the Habsburg family would give his dynasty the prestige it craved. Charles VI saw an opportunity. A marriage between Maria Josepha and the Saxon heir would secure Austria's northern border. But there was a problem. Saxony was the heartland of Lutheran Protestantism. A Catholic Habsburg Archduchess could not marry a heretic. Augustus the Strong, ever the pragmatist, ordered his son to convert to Catholicism. The young prince, Frederick Augustus, traveled to Italy, ostensibly for a grand tour, but in reality to undergo secret religious instruction. When he converted, the path was cleared. But Charles VI had one final, non-negotiable condition, a condition that revealed the depth of his insecurity. He would only agree to the marriage if Maria Josepha formally, legally, and publicly renounced her claim to the Habsburg throne. He wanted it in writing. He wanted it sealed with an oath before God. He wanted to ensure that neither she nor any child she ever bore could ever challenge his own descendants. The negotiations were brutal. Maria Josepha's mother, the Dowager Empress Wilhelmina Amalia, tried to fight for her daughter's rights, but they were powerless against the emperor's will. If Maria Josepha wanted to marry, if she wanted to escape the suffocating atmosphere of Vienna, she had to sign. On a cold day in August 1719, the ceremony of renunciation took place. It was a piece of political theater choreographed by Charles VI. Maria Josepha, dressed in solemn robes, stood before the crucifix and the Holy Gospels. The entire court watched, the same courtiers who had once pledged loyalty to her father. With a steady hand, she signed the Renunciation Act. In that moment, she signed away the empire. She signed away Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. She signed away the rights of her unborn children. She swore an oath that she would never pursue the throne as long as Charles VI or any of his descendants lived. It was a humiliating capitulation forced upon her by the man who was supposed to be her guardian. But in signing it, Maria Josepha also bought her freedom. She was no longer the emperor's hostage. She was now the crown princess of Saxony and Poland. The wedding that followed on August 20th, 1719, was one of the most lavish spectacles of the century. It was a month-long celebration of operas, balls, and hunts. It was Charles VI's way of saying goodbye and good riddance. He showered her with jewels and a massive dowry, paying her off to leave his realm. When Maria Josepha climbed into the carriage that would take her north to Dresden, she did not look back. She was leaving the city of her birth, the palace where her father had died, and the throne that had been stolen from her. She was heading into the unknown, to a Protestant land, where she was a stranger, married to a man she barely knew. But Maria Josepha carried something with her that Charles VI had not anticipated. She carried the blood of the Habsburgs, yes, but she also carried a burning desire to prove him wrong. He had cast her aside as tainted and irrelevant. She was about to spend the next 30 years proving that she was the most formidable woman the dynasty had produced in generations. The emperor thought he had silenced her. He had only moved her to a different chessboard. When Maria Josepha arrived in Dresden in the autumn of 1719, she stepped into a world that was radically different from the somber, incense-clouded halls of Vienna. Dresden, the capital of Saxony, was known as the Florence on the Elbe. It was a city exploding with Baroque creativity, fueled by the immense wealth of the Saxon electors. Her father-in-law, Augustus the Strong, was a man of titanic appetites, a collector of porcelain, women, and jewels, who had turned his capital into a glittering jewel box of art and excess. But beneath the gold leaf and the Meissen porcelain lay a treacherous political minefield. Saxony was the cradle of the Protestant Reformation. It was the land of Martin Luther. The vast majority of the population, the nobility and the clergy, were staunchly Lutheran. Yet, their ruling family had converted to Catholicism solely to gain the crown of Poland. Maria Josepha, a devout, unyielding Catholic Habsburg, was viewed with deep suspicion by her new subjects. To the Saxons, she was an agent of Rome, a foreign interloper who might try to force the Counter-Reformation upon them. To the Polish nobility, who were strictly Catholic, she was a necessary asset, a link to the prestigious Holy Roman Empire. Maria Josepha had to walk a razor's edge. One misstep could trigger religious riots or alienate the powerful Saxon estates, but it was here, away from the domineering shadow of her uncle Charles VI, that Maria Josepha discovered her true talent, diplomacy. She did not hide her faith, but she did not weaponize it. Instead, she used culture as her shield. She patronized Italian opera, commissioned magnificent sacred music, and turned the Dresden court into a beacon of high culture that rivaled Vienna itself. She transformed herself from a discarded Austrian archduchess into the cultural and moral anchor of the Saxon state. While she navigated the treacherous waters of Saxon politics, Maria Josepha began the most important campaign of her life, a campaign fought not with armies, but with biology. Remember the whispers in Vienna? The cruel rumors spread by Charles VI's faction that her father's syphilis had tainted her blood. that she was genetically compromised, likely infertile, or destined to birth weaklings? Maria Josepha spent the next 2 decades dismantling those lies with a vengeance that must have stung the emperor in Vienna. Between 1720 and 1740, Maria Josepha gave birth to 15 children. It was an astonishing feat of reproductive endurance and vitality, even for the 18th century. But these were not just any children. They were robust, healthy, and intelligent. Her sons grew up to be electors and administrators. Her daughters grew up to be dauphines and queens. Every birth announcement sent from Dresden to Vienna was a diplomatic slap in the face to Charles VI. While the emperor in Vienna was struggling desperately to produce a male heir, his only son died in infancy in 1716, leaving him with only daughters. His rejected niece was populating half the royal houses of Europe. The irony was blinding. The branch of the family that Charles VI had labeled as diseased and weak was proving to be the most vigorous line the Habsburgs had produced in centuries. Maria Josepha was proving year after year that the taint ended with her father. She was the living proof of Habsburg vitality, while Charles VI's line appeared to be withering on the vine. Maria Josepha's influence extended far beyond the nursery. Her husband, Frederick Augustus II, was a man of limited ability. He was lethargic, indecisive, and preferred hunting and watching operas to the grinding work of statecraft. He was the exact opposite of his domineering father, Augustus the Strong. Into this vacuum of leadership stepped Maria Josepha. She was not content to be a passive consort. Raised in the imperial school of Vienna, she understood power. She became her husband's primary advisor, his backbone, and often the decision-maker in all but name. She attended council meetings, managed the correspondence with foreign courts, and meticulously orchestrated the marriages of her children. Her power became undeniable in 1733, when her father-in-law, Augustus the Strong, died. The throne of Poland was elective, not hereditary. This meant that just because her husband was the son of the king, he did not automatically inherit the crown. He had to be elected by the Polish nobles, who were notoriously fickle and easily bribed by foreign powers. France was backing a rival candidate, Stanisław Leszczyński. This sparked the War of the Polish Succession. It was a brutal conflict that tore across Europe. Maria Josepha threw herself into the fray. She used her Habsburg connections to secure Austrian support for her husband. She rallied the Catholic bishops of Poland. She was instrumental in securing the coronation of her husband as King Augustus III of Poland in 1734. When she was crowned Queen of Poland in Krakow, it was a moment of supreme triumph. The girl, who had been stripped of her imperial birthright, was now a crowned queen in her own right, ruling over a dual nation that stretched from the gates of Berlin to the steppes of Ukraine. She had achieved a status that arguably rivaled that of her uncle in Vienna. She had built her own empire. While Maria Josepha was ascending in Dresden, the atmosphere in Vienna was descending into a slow, grinding panic. Emperor Charles VI was aging. He had become a man obsessed, consumed by a single, terrified thought: the pragmatic sanction. After the death of his only son in 1716, Charles VI realized that his daughter, Maria Theresa, would be his heir. But he knew that the wolves of Europe, Prussia, France, Bavaria, would not respect a female ruler, especially given the dubious legality of his changes to the succession laws. He knew deep down that he had broken the 1703 pact with his brother, and that this original sin made Maria Theresa's position vulnerable. So Charles VI spent the last 20 years of his life engaging in a humiliating diplomatic dance. He sacrificed everything to get the powers of Europe, to sign a piece of paper recognizing the pragmatic sanction. He gave away territories. He dissolved profitable trading companies to appease the British. He allowed the imperial army to rot and the treasury to bleed dry, all to buy signatures on a parchment. He looked at Dresden with a mixture of envy and fear. He saw Maria Josepha, Queen of Poland, mother of sons, rich and powerful. He knew that legally, under the old pacts, she had a better claim to his throne than his own daughter. He knew that if Maria Josepha ever decided to challenge Maria Theresa, half of Europe might back her. To prevent this, Charles VI kept up a facade of familial affection, but practically, he kept Dresden at arm's length. He relied on the renunciation oath Maria Josepha had signed in 1719 as his only shield. He foolishly believed that a signature on paper would matter more than the realities of power. He forgot the lesson he had taught her, that pacts are only as strong as the armies that enforce them. History often pits Maria Josepha against her cousin Maria Theresa, but in reality they rarely interacted. They were two women trapped in parallel cages constructed by men. Maria Theresa grew up in Vienna as the little Archduchess, adored by her father, but crucially, never trained by him. Charles VI loved her, but he refused to teach her the business of government. He couldn't bear to admit he wouldn't have a son, so he left Maria Theresa uneducated in statecraft, diplomacy, or war. She was raised to be a charming princess, not a ruler. Contrast this with Maria Josepha in Dresden. She was 20 years older than Maria Theresa. She was a seasoned political veteran. She had navigated religious strife, won a crown in a war of succession, managed a difficult husband, and raised a dynasty. By 1740, Maria Josepha was arguably the most qualified woman in Europe to rule an empire. Maria Theresa was a bright but inexperienced young woman of 23, completely unprepared for the wolves waiting at the door. The tension between the two cousins was palpable. Maria Josepha never openly attacked Maria Theresa, but she never let Vienna forget she was there. She maintained a pro-Austrian faction in Dresden, but she also kept lines of communication open with Austria's enemies. She was keeping her options open. She was waiting. The moment of reckoning arrived on October 20th, 1740. Emperor Charles VI went on a hunting trip near the Hungarian border. He ate a dish of stewed mushrooms, likely Amanita phalloides, the death cap. He fell violently ill. The man who had spent his life trying to control the future was suddenly faced with the uncontrollable nature of death. He died in agony at the Hofburg Palace, leaving behind a shattered empire. He left Maria Theresa with a bankrupt treasury, an army of only 80,000 poorly equipped men, and a cabinet of elderly, incompetent ministers. And he left her the pragmatic sanction, that expensive piece of paper he had bought with the empire's soul. Within weeks, the paper proved worthless. Frederick II of Prussia invaded the Austrian province of Silesia in December 1740. He didn't bother with a declaration of war. He simply marched. France followed. Bavaria followed. The War of the Austrian Succession had begun. The sharks smelled blood in the water. And in Dresden, the eyes of the world turned to Maria Josepha and her husband. What would they do? Legally, Maria Josepha had renounced her claim. But politically, the renunciation was forced. It was signed under duress. The old mutual pact of 1703, the one her father signed, was still remembered by legal scholars across Europe. If she wanted to, she could claim that her uncle's death voided her renunciation. She could claim she was the rightful empress. For a few breathless months in 1740 and 1741, the fate of the Habsburg monarchy hung on the decision of the forgotten Archduchess. Would she save her cousin, or would she destroy her? The decision her husband made, driven by his own ambition and her complex guidance, would result in the ultimate tragedy of Maria Josepha's life. It was the moment where the stolen Empress would try to take back what was hers, only to find that the price of the crown was higher than she could ever imagine. The winter of 1740 to 1741 in Dresden was one of the coldest in living memory, mirroring the chill that had descended upon the diplomatic relations of Europe. Maria Josepha stood at the absolute precipice of her life. The news from Vienna was chaotic. Her cousin Maria Theresa was under siege. Frederick of Prussia had seized Silesia. The French were massing on the borders. The Bavarian elector, Charles Albert, was openly claiming the imperial throne. In the gilded council chambers of Dresden, Maria Josepha's husband, King Augustus III, and his cunning, avaricious prime minister, Count Heinrich von Brühl, laid a map of the Habsburg territories on the table. They looked at Moravia. They looked at Bohemia. They saw a carcass ready to be carved. Count Brühl whispered the seductive logic of realpolitik into the king's ear. The renunciation of 1719 was void because Charles VI had failed to secure the empire's safety. The Habsburg inheritance, or at least a large chunk of it, belonged to Maria Josepha by right of the old 1703 pact. If Saxony did not strike now, Prussia and Bavaria would take everything, and Saxony would be left with nothing. For Maria Josepha, this was a moment of supreme spiritual agony. To claim her inheritance meant declaring war on her own homeland. It meant attacking the very palace where she was born. It meant trying to dethrone her own cousin, Maria Theresa, a young mother holding a newborn baby, just as Maria Josepha had once been. But the bitterness of the past 30 years welled up. She remembered the humiliation of the pragmatic sanction. She remembered her uncle Charles VI casting her aside as tainted. She remembered the years of exile. Was this not God's justice? Was this not the moment to reclaim the birthright that had been stolen from her father's line? After weeks of prayer and agonizing debate, Maria Josepha made the fateful decision to support her husband's ambition. She would not stop him. In fact, she would lend her name to the cause. In 1741, Saxony formally joined the Alliance of Nymphenburg, a coalition of France, Spain, Bavaria, and Prussia, dedicated to the destruction of Maria Theresa's Austria. It was the ultimate betrayal of the family bond, fueled by a generation of resentment. The forgotten Archduchess was going to war. The Saxon army marched south into Bohemia, fighting alongside the French and Bavarian forces. For a brief, dizzying moment, it seemed as though the Habsburg Empire was finished. In November 1741, the Allied forces stormed Prague, the capital of Bohemia. It was a stunning victory. However, the victory tasted of ash. While the Bavarian elector Charles Albert had himself crowned as Holy Roman Emperor Charles VII, the first non-Habsburg emperor in centuries, Maria Josepha received little glory. Her husband, Augustus, was a sluggish military commander, and the Prussians were stealing all the thunder. Frederick the Great treated the Saxons not as partners, but as useful idiots. He used the Saxon army to distract the Austrians, while he solidified his hold on rich Silesia. Back in Dresden, Maria Josepha received reports of the war with a heavy heart. She was technically winning, yet she was losing her soul. She heard stories of Austrian villages burning. She heard of the desperate heroism of Maria Theresa, who had fled to Hungary and stood before the Hungarian Diet holding her infant son, begging the nobles for help. The Hungarians had drawn their sabers and shouted, "Vitam et sanguinem, pro rege nostro Maria Theresa." That moment haunted Maria Josepha. Maria Theresa, the untrained, unprepared girl, was displaying a charisma and grit that Charles VI never had. She was rallying the empire through sheer force of will. Meanwhile, Maria Josepha found herself allied with the traditional enemies of her house, the French and the Protestants. She was fighting on the wrong side of history, and she knew it. The tainted blood wasn't the syphilis of her father anymore. It was the stain of treason she now felt on her own conscience. The alliance of Nymphenburg collapsed because it was built on greed, not loyalty. Frederick the Great, having got what he wanted, made a separate, secret peace with Maria Theresa in 1742, leaving his allies, including Saxony, exposed to the wrath of the Austrian army. It was a masterclass in cynicism. Suddenly, the Saxons were alone against a resurgent Austria. The Austrian armies, fueled by Hungarian fury, turned north. They didn't just push the Saxons out of Bohemia, they threatened to invade Saxony itself. Maria Josepha watched her husband's dreams of conquest crumble. The Moravian corridor they had hoped to annex vanished. The treasury was empty. Thousands of Saxon soldiers were dead. The gamble had failed. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her uncle Charles VI had been cruel, yes, but Frederick of Prussia was a monster. He had used Maria Josepha's legitimate claims as a smokescreen for his own land grab and then discarded her. In this moment of defeat, Maria Josepha regained her moral clarity. She realized that the true enemy of her house was not Maria Theresa, but the rising power of Prussia. If the Habsburgs destroyed each other, only the Protestant North would win. By 1745, the situation was catastrophic. The Prussians had re-entered the war and defeated the Saxons in a series of humiliating battles. The old Dessauer, a Prussian general, smashed the Saxon army at the Battle of Kesselsdorf. Dresden, the jewel-box city, was wide open. Frederick the Great marched into Maria Josepha's capital as a conqueror. This was Maria Josepha's darkest hour. She was trapped in her palace, effectively a prisoner of the Prussian king. Frederick was cold, acerbic, and mockingly polite. He played the flute in her opera house while her husband fled to Poland. It fell to Maria Josepha to negotiate the survival of her adopted country. On Christmas Day, 1745, the Treaty of Dresden was signed. It was a peace of exhaustion. Saxony had to pay massive reparations to Prussia. They had to acknowledge Frederick's ownership of Silesia. And, most painfully for Maria Josepha, they had to formally recognize Maria Theresa as the legitimate Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, and her husband, Francis Stephen, as the new Holy Roman Emperor. Maria Josepha had to swallow her pride completely. She had to write to her cousin, Maria Theresa, and acknowledge her victory. The rivalry was over. Maria Theresa had won. The stolen Empress would never sit on the throne of Vienna. But in this defeat, a strange reconciliation began. Maria Theresa, magnanimous in victory, accepted the olive branch. The two branches of the family, sundered by the pragmatic sanction and the war, began to heal. They were united by a shared hatred of Frederick the Great. With her political ambitions for herself crushed, Maria Josepha turned her formidable energy to the only battlefield she had left, the marriage market. She was determined that if she could not be empress, her children would rule the world. In 1746, the Dauphin of France died in childbirth. The French court needed a new bride for the Dauphin, Louis Ferdinand. It was the most prestigious vacancy in Europe, the future Queen of France. Maria Josepha set her sights on this prize for her daughter, who was also named Maria Josepha. But the ghosts of the past rose up again. The French court was hesitant. Why? Because of the old rumors. The French courtiers whispered that the Saxon princess was the granddaughter of Emperor Joseph I, the man who died of shameful diseases. They whispered that the tainted blood would bring disaster to the Bourbons. They also pointed out that her father, Augustus III, had been an enemy of France in the recent stages of the war. The influential mistress of Louis XV, Madame de Pompadour, and the General Marshal Saxe fought hard for the match. Marshal Saxe assured the King of France that his niece was healthy, fertile, and morally impeccable, just like her mother. Maria Josepha fought like a tigress from Dresden. She pulled every string, used every diplomatic favor, and she won. In 1747, the marriage was agreed. Her daughter, the 15-year-old Maria Josepha of Saxony, would marry the Dauphin of France. The departure of her daughter to France was a moment of triumph, mixed with profound foreboding. The younger Maria Josepha was intelligent and pious, much like her mother, but she was entering the snake pit of Versailles. When the young princess arrived in France, she was treated with coldness. The Dauphin was still mourning his first wife and resented this Saxon woman forced upon him. The court mocked her appearance. She had the distinct Habsburg features, although softened. They called her ugly behind her back. But here, history repeated itself in the most beautiful way. Just as the elder Maria Josepha had won over Saxony with her piety and fertility, the younger Maria Josepha won over the Dauphin and the French court. She was patient, she was kind, and she was incredibly fertile. The elder Maria Josepha, watching from Dresden, saw her own vindication. Her daughter gave birth to son after son. The tainted line was securing the succession of the mighty Bourbon dynasty. Among those children was a boy named Louis Auguste, the future King Louis XVI, and another named Louis Stanislas, and another named Charles. Maria Josepha of Austria had become the grandmother of the last kings of France. She had woven her DNA into the very fabric of European history. The irony was supreme. The Habsburgs in Vienna had married into the French family, but it was Maria Josepha's line that provided the king himself. The two rival cousins, Maria Josepha and Maria Theresa, would become the dual grandmothers of the tragedy of the French Revolution. After the Peace of Dresden and the French marriage, Maria Josepha entered the final decade of her life. She was tired, her body worn out by 14 pregnancies, and the immense stress of high-stakes politics began to fail her. But her mind remained sharp. She watched as the peace in Europe unraveled yet again. In 1756, the 7 Years' War erupted. It was World War I, a conflict fought on multiple continents. And once again, Saxony was the victim. Frederick the Great, paranoid about an alliance of women, decided to strike first. He invaded Saxony again. This time, the invasion was brutal and total. The Saxon army was surrounded and forced to surrender en masse at Pirna. Maria Josepha's husband, King Augustus, fled to Poland, leaving his wife behind in Dresden to face the Prussians. For the last year of her life, Maria Josepha was the de facto head of state in occupied Dresden. She was a prisoner in her own palace, surrounded by Prussian guards. Frederick the Great stripped the palace of its treasures. He looted the archives. He turned Saxony into a supply depot for his army. Yet Maria Josepha refused to leave. She wrote furious letters to the courts of Europe, denouncing Frederick's aggression. She organized food for the starving citizens of Dresden. She turned the royal palace into a symbol of silent resistance. When Frederick the Great demanded the keys to the secret archives, Maria Josepha physically stood in front of the door. She blocked the way with her own body, defying the most feared military commander in Europe. It was her final act of defiance. The girl who had been silenced by her uncle in 1713, had become the woman who stared down the King of Prussia in 1756. The final year of Maria Josepha's life played out like a Greek tragedy confined within the walls of the Dresden Residenzschloss. The city outside was a war zone. Prussian troops patrolled the streets, commandeering houses, seizing grain, and impressing young Saxon men into Frederick the Great's army. The vibrant Florence on the Elbe was being strangled. Inside the palace, Maria Josepha was effectively under house arrest. Her husband, King Augustus, had fled to the safety of Warsaw, leaving her as the sole representative of the Saxon state. It was a terrifying position for a 57-year-old woman, yet it was here that the steel of her Habsburg upbringing shone brightest. Frederick the Great, the warrior philosopher King of Prussia, had taken up residence in her capital. He treated Saxony not as a conquered nation, but as a resource to be drained dry. The climax of this psychological duel occurred over the issue of the secret archives. Frederick was convinced that the archives contained proof of a coalition between Saxony, Austria, and Russia to destroy Prussia. He needed those papers to justify his invasion to the world. He sent his officers to break into the Geheimkabinettskanzlei. But when the Prussian officers arrived with axes and crowbars, they found an obstacle they hadn't expected. Maria Josepha stood in front of the door. She was not the young, hopeful Archduchess of 1711 anymore. She was an elderly queen, heavy with age and exhaustion, but she physically placed herself between the Prussian soldiers and the secrets of her state. She declared that they would have to use force against the Queen of Poland if they wanted to pass. It was a moment of breathtaking physical courage. For a few tense hours, the mighty Prussian military machine was halted by one woman's refusal to move. Frederick the Great was forced to intervene. While he eventually ordered his men to cut through the wall to bypass her, he reportedly expressed a grudging admiration for her. He later wrote that she was a great politician, and the only man in the Saxon government was the queen herself. It was the ultimate compliment from the misogynistic Frederick, acknowledging that Maria Josepha possessed the royal fire that her husband lacked. The stress of the occupation, however, was lethal. Maria Josepha was forced to watch as Frederick dismantled the country she had spent 30 years building. He shipped the contents of the armory to Berlin. He levied crushing taxes. Every day brought news of another Austrian defeat or another Saxon humiliation. The queen was cut off from her children. Her son, the Dauphin in France, could do nothing. Her daughter in Spain could do nothing. Her cousin, Maria Theresa in Vienna, was fighting for her own survival. Maria Josepha was isolated in a cold palace, surrounded by enemies, carrying the weight of the entire dynasty on her failing heart. On November 17, 1757, the inevitable happened. Maria Josepha suffered a massive stroke. She died as she had lived. Amidst the chaos of a war caused by male ambition, there was no grand state funeral. Dresden was an occupied city. Her husband was hundreds of miles away in Warsaw. She died essentially a prisoner of war. When the news reached Frederick the Great, he was silent. When the news reached Vienna, Maria Theresa reportedly wept. The rivalry was over. The stolen Empress had left the stage. She was buried in the Wetten crypt of the Katholische Hofkirche in Dresden, the cathedral she had helped build, a symbol of her Catholic faith in a Protestant land. With Maria Josepha gone, the soul of the Saxon resistance evaporated. Her husband, Augustus III, died just 6 years later in 1763, shortly after the war ended. The Augustan Age of Saxony, that brief, glittering period where Dresden rivaled Vienna and Versailles, came to a crashing end. Saxony never recovered its status as a great power. It was reduced to a second-tier state, forever squeezed between the rising giants of Prussia and Austria. In a way, Maria Josepha's death marked the end of the Baroque dream of a Saxon-Polish empire. Maria Josepha's war was over. Her conquest was just beginning. We must return one last time to the dark secret that started this entire story. The tainted blood of Emperor Joseph I, the syphilis, the rumors of weakness, rot, and infertility that Charles VI used as a weapon to justify the pragmatic sanction and steal Maria Josepha's throne. History did not just disprove that lie, it dismantled it with a cruelty that would have made the old emperor weep. Ultimately, the verdict was written in DNA. While the pure line of her uncle Charles VI withered, his male heirs dying in infancy, and his dynasty losing its grip on the Holy Roman Empire. Maria Josepha's diseased genes exploded across the continent with terrifying vitality. The woman branded as unfit to rule became the genetic architect of modern Europe. Her namesake daughter became the mother of 3 French kings, Louis XVI, Louis XVIII, and Charles X. It is a staggering irony that the very blood once deemed rotten in Vienna flowed through the veins of the king who faced the guillotine in the French Revolution. Her daughter Maria Amalia became the beloved Queen of Spain, modernizing Madrid alongside Charles III. From the palaces of Naples to the courts of Saxony, the crowns of Europe were resting on heads that owed their existence to the rejected Archduchess. Charles VI broke every law of honor to ensure his daughter, Maria Theresa, would rule. He succeeded in saving a crown, but he lost the future. The niece he discarded quietly colonized the rest of the world with her progeny. If you look at a family tree of European royalty today, almost everyone descends from Maria Josepha. She is the true grandmother of kings. So how should we remember the woman who lived her entire life in the conditional tense? She was the empress who should have been. She was the ruler who might have prevented the wars of succession, but she refused to be a ghost. She defeated the lie of her father's shame by becoming the matriarch of the continent. She defeated the irrelevance of exile by turning Dresden into a cultural superpower. She defeated the silence of submission by physically standing up to Frederick the Great when all the men had fled. Maria Theresa gets the golden statues in the grand public squares, but Maria Josepha gets the quiet, enduring victory of survival. The next time you read about the fall of the French monarchy or the rise of the Spanish Bourbons or the wars that shaped the 18th century, remember the woman in the shadows. Remember the 11-year-old girl who was told she was nothing, and the 57-year-old queen who died holding the door against the storm. She was Maria Josepha, the stolen empress, and her story is the secret heartbeat of the empire that tried to forget her.